حيث لا يحتسب ومن انقطع إلى الدنيا وكله الله إليها. Respected listeners, ulama, mashayikh, mothers and sisters listening at home, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the 7th presentation out of this series of 10 on the 10 characteristics that a person should inculcate as advised by Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayh within his Ihya Ulumuddin. And these 10 are known as the munjiyat, those things, those characteristics that a person should inculcate in their spiritual life, which will ultimately lead them to salvation in the hereafter. Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi in this section looks at the point of tawakkul, that this is a characteristic that a person should inculcate into his life. And what can we say? Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi has presented this in a very short fashion, but anyone who's familiar with Fazail Sadaqat of Hazrat Shaykh rahmatullah alayhi, then in great depth in chapter 6 and chapter 7 of Fazail Sadaqat, part 2, Hazrat Shaykh rahmatullah alayhi very beautifully presents all of this there in a very soluble and easy to swallow manner, which can easily be swallowed and acted upon. So I'm just going to attempt as a student to explain some of this, but if you want to read it in detail, then I would suggest, as we've always keep on repeating time and again, that read Fazail Amal and read Fazail Sadaqat. Sometimes we think that it's inside our shelves, we're reading it for the last 40, 50 years, 60 years, 70 years since the Shaykh put it together, but at the end of the day, the value of something, we don't really value it until we look at it properly. And we'll only understand the value of it in the hereafter. Allah will give us the tawfiq. Anyway, Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi here, he mentions a number of verses. Hazrat Shaykh rahmatullah alayhi on this topic mentions 41 verses, and he has a brilliant explanation. Then he explains lots of hadith. Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi, he only mentions a few. He says, Allah Almighty says in the Quran Kareem, وَعَلَى اللَّهِ فَلْيَتَوَكَّلِ الْمُتَوَكِّلُونَ, and upon Allah, let those who do tawakkul rely. In another verse he says, وَعَلَى اللَّهِ فَتَوَكَّلُوا إِن كُنتُم مُؤْمِنِينَ, if you are believers, then upon Allah make your tawakkul. In another verse he says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُحِبُّ الْمُتَوَكِّلِينَ, indeed Allah Almighty loves those who do tawakkul. وقال تعالى من يتوكل ومن يتوكل الله فهو حسبه, the person who does tawakkul and relies upon Allah فهو حسبه, then he is sufficient for him. In another verse Allah says, أليس الله بكاف عبده, Allah Almighty says rhetorically, I'll ask the question rhetorically, that أليس Allah, is Allah not enough for his slave? In another verse he says, إن الذين تعبدون من دون الله, indeed those that you worship aside from Allah Almighty, لا يملكون لكم رزقا, in addressing the disbelievers, لا يملكون لكم رزقا, they do not control or possess for you rizq. فابتغوا عند الله رزق, seek your rizq with Allah Almighty. And then there's a beautiful hadith he mentions, Nabi Kareem sallallahu alayhi wasallam, narrated by in Musnad al-Shihab, and the Tabrani is Awsat al-Bayhaqi in Ishab. He mentions that Allah Almighty, Nabi Kareem sallallahu alayhi wasallam says, لو أنكم تتوكلون الله حق توكله, if you were to do tawakkul upon Allah Almighty, حق توكله, as you should rely upon Him, as you should do tawakkul to Him, in the way it should be, in the manner it should be, رزقكم كما يرزق الطير, He will give you rizq. He will give you rizq in the way that the bird is given rizq. Tagdu khamasan, in the morning it leaves empty stomach, he has nothing. Yeah. Wataruhu bitanan, and then he comes back in the evening with his stomach full. In another hadith he says, Man inkata idallah, whoever separates himself, sits in khalwat to Allah Almighty, kafahu Allah ta'ala kulla ma'unatin, Allah Almighty shall suffice for him every need. And if a person has, and we say it's very easy to say, but bringing the yaqeen into our heart, if a person was to separate himself for Allah Almighty, then Allah Almighty will fulfill every one of his needs. وَرَزَقَهُ مِنْ حَيْثُ لَا يَحْتَسِبْ, and he shall give him rizq from where he shall not even imagine or know or hope or desire or think. وَمَنْ إِنْكَتَ إِلَى الدُّنْيا, and whoever separates himself to earn the dunya, he becomes a abdul dinar wa abdul dirham, that he becomes a slave of the dunya and a slave of the dinar and the dirham. Then وَكَلَهُ اللَّهُ إِلَيْهَا, Allah Almighty leaves the person for that, and He leaves him to the dunya. In another hadith, Nabi Kareem sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, إِذَا أَصَابَ أَهْلَهُ, he says about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, إِذَا أَصَابَ أَهْلَهُ خَصَاصًا, when when poverty used to affect, or his family would become impoverished, qala, he would say, qumu ila salah. He would say to them that stand for prayer. وَيَقُولُ, and he would also say, بِهَذَا أَمَرَنِي رَبِّي, Allah Almighty, my Lord, has commanded me to do so. And then he would recite the verse of the Quran. And if their poverty comes to them, difficulty comes, he tell them to pray salah. And he would say that my Lord Almighty has commanded me to do this. And then he would recite the verse, وَأْمُرْ أَهْلَكَ بِالصَّلَاةِ وَاسْتَبِرْ عَلَيْهَا, that command your family bis-salah, for prayer, wastabir, and remain steadfast upon that. La nas'aluka rizqa, we do not ask you for risk. Nahnu narzukuk, it is us, Allah Almighty, that gives you risk. Wal akibatu lit taqwa, and the best outcome is for taqwa, for the fear of Allah Almighty. So, what is tawakkul? Hazrat Shaykh Rahmatullah Alayhi mentions this very beautifully in Fazail al-Sadaqat. He says, as a matter of fact, the entire subject matter of the Holy Quran in its entirety comprises exhortations and encouragement to cultivate a firm belief in the oneness of Allah Almighty. And Tawheed is the theme that runs throughout the Quran. Oneness of Allah Almighty, monotheism, Tawheed, believing in the one Allah Almighty. And Tawakkul is the essence of Tawheed. Yani the nichor and the essence of Tawakkul, of Tawheed is Tawakkul. The more firmly grounded anybody is in his belief in Tawheed, the more a person is firmly grounded in his understanding that there is only one Allah who is the doer and giver and the one who grants everything, then the more advanced the person will be in his tawakkul. He will progress in his tawakkul. And the more averse to seeking the help of anyone other than Allah Almighty. Imam Ghazali Rahmatullah Alayhi, as a Shaykh Rahmatullah Alayhi, as I always say, that he provides the explanation in a soluble fashion for us to quickly put in our mouth and swallow. Imam Ghazali Rahmatullah Alayhi explains in a slightly more complicated way. He says that there's three pillars. He says tawakkul has three pillars: knowledge and an understanding, a state that a person should be in, and certain actions. He also says before that, he says that tawakkul is that one considers Allah Almighty the one, the absolute doer, the perfect in his qualities, no partners. Yeah, and then he says that there's three pillars. One is the knowledge, understanding something. What should you understand? You should understand that there is a thing called Tawheed, monotheism. La ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah, lahul mulku wa lahul hamdu wa huwa ala kulli shay'in qadir. The kalima Tawheed. The La ilaha illallah, there is none worthy of worship except for Allah. Wahdahu la sharika lah, alone Him. La sharika lah, He has no partner. La wahdahu la sharika, lahul mulku wa lahul hamd, for Him is kingdom. Lahul mulku wa lahul hamd, and all praise. Lahul mulku wa lahul hamd, yuhyi wa yumeet, wa ala kulli shay'in qadir. He gives life and He gives death. Wa huwa ala kulli shay'in qadir, and He is powerful over all things. Yeah. Whoever affirms this with sincerity, that Iman will be established in his heart. And then he will be able to have the foundation to do tawakkul. But the condition is that sincerity of this, the sincerity of the kalima, has to be inside the heart. And when the sincerity of the kalima is, and however more sincere the kalima is inside one's heart, and more establishment of tawheed, then a person will have a greater level of tawakkul. So that's the first thing, the knowledge. That Allah Almighty is the giver and doer of everything. That's the first thing. The second thing is I was conditioned mentally. The meaning of this is that we should leave our affairs to Allah Almighty. Be at peace with ourselves. Do not turn to anything aside from Allah Almighty. Mentally, don't turn to anything aside from Allah. You do your little bit. You tie your camel, but you do tawakkul on Allah Almighty. Yeah. Imam Ghazali Rahmatullah Alayhi, he gives the example of a person who's been involved in a case, a court case, a very difficult court case. He doesn't understand what to do. He goes to a barrister, an extremely, a proper barrister, a real barrister, yeah? Someone who knows the ins and outs of the law and how to get him out of it. And he presents the case to this person. And he says to him, this guy's got a track record. He's got the worst people off, yeah? The police hate him. They dislike this person. Why? Because he's one of those old school barristers who knows how to get someone off the hook. Yeah? And he entrusts this person, he presents the case to him, and the barrister says to him, don't worry, I've got it all sorted. I've got your back. I've got you covered. Yeah? And this person, he'll go home, he might be a little bit trepid in the way he behaves, but he'll be content because he knows that, that particular QC or KC or whatever you want to call him, he's got his back covered. And he said, don't worry, I'll get you out of this. It's easy. It's not a very, it's not a very complicated matter. Yeah? He's paying him the money and he's content. And he goes home and he sleeps with rest. Why? Because he knows that he's given his matter over to someone who's most knowledgeable. Someone who understands the matter. He understands the law. And he's capable. And he's going to be able to give him the protection that he wants. Yeah? He'll sit at home resting, that he knows he's sorted. He's got his back covered. Likewise, when it comes to insan in the dunya, when he knows that his risk is with Allah Almighty, all of his affairs are in Allah's hands. There's none aside from Allah who has control over anything. We think we're in control of things. But when that difficulty comes, your friends drop off, you don't need to be in a physical straitjacket. You know you're in a difficulty. Yeah? You could have 6 brothers. No one might be there for you at that time. Yeah? You could have your entire family, but that's a mental straitjacket that you're stuck in and you can't get out. You don't know how to get out. Where's the door to get out? You don't know where you are. You're living in the community, but it's Allah who's everything. That's when you understand this. Imam Ghazali Rahmatullah Alayhi says in the same way that when you give your affairs over to a barrister who knows what he's doing, likewise, you've given your matter over to Allah Almighty. You should be content that Allah Almighty is going to resolve any matter. And if a person at this point, he doesn't have the firm belief, or he doesn't do tawakkul in the level that there should be, what is the reason behind this? He says there's 2 things. One is that the complete yaqeen on Allah Almighty is weak, and he needs to affect this. He needs to work on this. Or the second thing is maybe he's a bit weak from his heart. He's not able to tolerate like this. So this is the second thing, that person's knowledge. The second thing is his mental state like this. The third thing is actions. What should his actions actually be? Yeah? And at this point, Imam Ghazali Rahmatullah, something that he mentions in his time, which also resonates with us in this day and age. He says at this point in time, and at this point he mentions that sometimes the ignorant thinks that tawakkul is leaving work, not working. Yeah? Tawakkul is not taking medicine. Tawakkul is throwing yourself in harm's way. And when I read this, I smiled because I thought to myself, it's exactly a scenario that some of us also experience in our lives, and we see this happening in this day and age as well. Well, Imam Ghazali Rahmatullah Alayhi, then he explains this in a very beautiful way, which is actually quite interesting. I mean, the whole section is quite long and I haven't gone over everything, but just a few salient points. Imam Ghazali Rahmatullah Alayhi says that thinking like this, that tawakkul is not going to work. Yeah? Garbina, MBBS, Mufti Shabir Sahab, our Ustad at Down Bari used to say, MBBS, member of Beta Bet Society. Yeah? Right? Garbina, Tayyar Rotlo. Right? So, he says, this is completely wrong. Not taking medicine when you're ill. If you've got an illness, not taking medicine, again, this is wrong. He says, in fact, this is haram in Shariat. Yeah? Throwing yourself in harm's way, again, haram in Shariat. Then a question arises. If an objection comes at this point in time, on the one hand, tawakkul, relying on Allah Almighty, Moulana, you mentioned all these verses. You said, as Shaykh Rahmatullah Alayhi has mentioned 41 verses, and so many Quran, so many ahadith. The tawakkul is recommended. We should all do tawakkul. It's a sign of pure tawheed in a person's heart. Right? Trusting in Allah Almighty. But then, not working, not taking, but at the same time, how can it be that not working, or not going for a job, or not taking medicine, is against Sharia? Explain this. There's a bit of a conundrum here. And we see the situation, Imam Ghazali in his time, he mentions this, but then he explains this further, and he explains what a person's mindset should be, which is quite interesting. He says, and the answer is, that when it comes to a person's efforts, the mehnat that he does, you could be categorized into 4 categories. Number 1, you're acquiring something beneficial that you do not have. That's number 1. Number 2, the effort to preserve a benefit in existence. So it's something you have, but you're trying to really keep it with you. Yeah. The third thing is, and the third and the fourth are together really, an effort to repel a harm. Some difficulty is there, right? It's coming your way, but you make some effort to avoid it. Or an effort to remove a difficulty you're already in. So these are 4 types of effort that a person does. So Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi says, when it comes to the first, that acquiring a benefit, something faidaman, something beneficial that you don't have. Yeah? He says, when it comes to this, there are 3 causes for this. Number 1, you're certain that acquiring it will lead to a benefit. Yeah? You're definitely sure. Going to work in the morning, you're going to get a salary, and that salary is going to come. That yaqeen is there, and you know that's going to come. Right? And the example he gives is a person is hungry. Food is present. He's hungry. Food is there. He extends his hand, he's going to benefit himself. But he doesn't extend his hands. And he says, I'm a mutawakkil. I'm doing tawakkul. Or a person wants a son, but he doesn't go to his spouse. And he says, I'm doing tawakkul. Asmanti utar se. Yeah? Will the child come from the skies? Or a person, he wants to grow wheat in his farm or in his allotment. He wants to grow tomatoes and cucumbers and all the rest of it. But he doesn't want to go there and do the effort or sow the seeds. He just wants to tawakkul. Bas khalas. Tasbihate padina bi zawan. That's it. Wazifo. Yeah? He says that. So Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi says that when you know that this is going to lead to a benefit, having such thoughts is ignorance. Yeah? The sunnat of Allah Almighty in all of these things doesn't change. Adopting the means necessary in terms of Sharia is necessary. A person should adopt the means. He should extend his hand, take a morsel, put it in his mouth. He should go to his wife. He should go out and harvest the land and crop and sow the seeds. But at the same time, his mindset should be something else. He should recognize that the hand, the visiting of one's spouse, the planting of seeds, all of this is actually from Allah Almighty. These are sabab, but the means, but the actual originator of the action and the one who's giving the child, the one who's removing the hunger, and the one who's actually allowing the crops to grow is Allah Almighty. It's through the power of Allah Almighty. Rather than sitting there and saying, I'm going to sit at home but not go to work. Go to work but consider it to be a means, but the original giver is Allah Almighty. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, don't place your trust on the sabab. The job is not what's keeping you alive. The job isn't what's keeping your money in. But the person who's bringing you money, giving you money, is the hukm of Allah Almighty. Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi says, when a person keeps both of these things in his minds, and he tries and makes efforts, adopts the sabab, there's no harm in this, and this is not contrary to tawakkul. This is not contrary to tawakkul. So that's the first thing. The action is that you carry out you carry out an action that's going to lead certainly to a benefit. There's another one. He says the second action is that one is inclined to an action that he thinks it will likely benefit. Right? Most likely benefit. It's not definite, but it's most likely beneficial. Right? And he says that person takes food on a journey through the wilderness. He's traveling on a camel or a horse through the wilderness. He takes his water and he takes his food with him. Right? And he thinks to himself that if he doesn't take anything with him, then it might be the case that the journey becomes prolonged. He's not going to find water. He might pass away. He might pass away, right? It's not definite he's going to pass away. It might happen. So he's making amends, or he's taking steps for a difficulty that's perceived, right? Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi says that if a person takes something along with him, and obviously he has hope and he does tawakkul on Allah Almighty, and he takes something with him along that way, then this is not against tawakkul. But it's the way of the pious, and one should always remember that his mind should be on Allah Almighty. The third scenario is, he says, that a person thinks it might be the case that if he carries out such an action, it might be the case that he will benefit greatly from it, or he might benefit from it. And the example that he gives here is that a person, in order to acquire a lot of wealth, he tries more than he needs to. He works more than 37.5 hours a week. He works 70 hours, 80 hours. He really tries. He puts the elbow grease in. Yeah? He really puts the elbow grease in. He wants to fill his pocket up. That's it. Everything is there. Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi says that this is actually hirs. It's tama'. it's coveting more than you need, it's greediness. And he says that a person at times, this also then leads to a person acquiring wealth that is haram and doubtful, and this is definitely against tawakkul. Whatever is little you've got and it's sufficient, be happy with that. So these are the first things, that acquiring something beneficial that a person does not have, and he's explained that. Then he says that when it comes to the efforts, the second effort is to safeguard something that is beneficial that one has. So for example, a person has wealth and he wants to hoard the wealth, keep the wealth. And you know, we do struggle in this day and age. But Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi says, he says that to keep wealth that's more sufficient for more than 1 year, according to him, is against tawakkul. He says that if a person only, but there's a way out, and he mentions it later. He says that if a person only keeps for 1 day, then that is perfect tawakkul. Yeah? That's perfect tawakkul. If he keeps for 40 days, then he says there's ikhtilaf in this. Some of the mashayikh say this is okay, some say not. Then he says that if a person has a family, then to save for 1 year is not against tawakkul. If a person has a family and expenses, to save for tawakkul isn't against tawakkul. And then he says that preparing for more than a year is contrary to tawakkul. And the reason he gives for this is that person is then involved in procrastination, tawlul amal, yeah, hoping and having greater desires, and then thinking about, you know, worrying about hunger when Allah Almighty is going to provide. But the reality here is that Imam Ghazali rahmatullah said what he said, but our mashayikh, as the Shaykh al-Hadith Manzakir rahmatullah alayh, if you read some of his letters, especially those letters written to Hazrat Moulana Yusuf Mutawwal Sahib rahmatullah alayh, and Hazrat writes that, you know, I feel like giving up, not taking a salary from Darulum. Yeah? So Hazrat rahmatullah alayh, Hazrat Shaykh rahmatullah then guides him very softly on that path of how to adopt a way to become mutawakkil, have complete tawakkul. But for the time being, especially for the beginner, for people whose himmat is very weak like us, Hazrat Shaykh rahmatullah alayhi, from what you can understand from what he's written, that, you know, take it easy a little bit. Get involved in amal. Don't rush into it, because it doesn't happen straight away. Iman should be built. A person's connection to Allah should be built. Steadfastness should be created. And then the capacity should be created in a person to reach that level. And that is something that a person should aspire to. And that can be done through the mashayikh. Anyway, after that, Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi then says that if a situation arises that when it comes to an effort, the effort to repel a harm coming your way. There's a dog, a bully XL, as they say, yeah, it's running your way. So for you to run the other way, right, at that point, for example, yeah, you can stand there and say, I'm doing tawakkul, it'll go for you, right? But you can run away. Or there's a difficulty that a person's already involved in, yeah? So for example, he's got an illness and he needs to get rid of this illness, and he takes ilaj and he takes medicine, yeah? Or, you know, there's a flood in his house and he wants to remove the water. Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi says that you should take the means to remove all of these things. To say that I'm just going to leave it and abandon myself, I'm just sit there and sit back and watch and hope it'll go away and do tawakkul on Allah Almighty, that's not the right way to do it. You take the means, and by taking the means, you then move on and have the mindset that is Allah Almighty, it's the qudrat of Allah Almighty that's actually assisting me and helping me. So this is the nature and the explanation of what tawakkul actually is. May Allah Almighty give us all the tawfiq. For greater reading on this, I would say that's chapter 6 of Fazail Amal, which is all on tawakkul. And then as the Shaykh rahmatullah alayhi, right at the end, he finishes off with, I think, 40 stories of the pious. In one of his letters to Moulana Yusuf Mutawwal Sahib rahmatullah alayhi, the Shaykh rahmatullah alayhi writes that, and those stories are about mashayikh and buzrugs and sahaba and tabi'in and tabi tabi'in and all and their position on tawakkul and reliance on Allah Almighty and other things that soften the heart and help us to detach ourselves from the dunya. As the Shaykh rahmatullah alayhi in the letters of Moulana Yusuf rahmatullah alayhi mentions that England walo ke liye, for the people of England, these stories should be specially read. So you could possibly say that the 40 stories at the end of Fazail Amal are specifically, as the Shaykh said in his letter to Moulana Yusuf rahmatullah alayhi, that those letters are specific for the people of England and the situation here where everyone's running after dunya. May Allah Almighty give us all the tawfiq to act upon all of this. Inshallah, we'll carry on next week, and the lecture next week will be on mahabba, love. or love of Allah Almighty. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.